Up next in the broadcast, North Korea's live fire drills cross the disputed maritime border with South Korea. Seoul responds with artillery fire and F-15K fighter jets. Meanwhile, Pyongyang threatens a new kind of nuclear test. Seoul says should that happen, the North would pay the price. And Korean scientists bring us to a world where a nanotechnology skin patch monitors, analyzes, and immediately delivers medication. Primetime News begins now.
어느 지역에서 정상적인 타석을 거행하고 있다.
Good evening to our viewers in Korea, and hello to those of you who are watching from around the world. It's Monday, March 31st here in Seoul. I am Lee Ji-hye.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thank you so much for joining us. We begin this evening with the latest skirmish between the two Koreas. Seoul and Pyongyang exchanged fire across the western maritime border on Monday after the North's artillery shells fell into waters in the south.
For more on the renewed tensions on the Korean peninsula, we go live to our correspondent Hwang Sung-hee at the Arirang News Center. Now, Sung-hee, what can you tell us?
Ji-hye, the exchange of fire between the two Koreas came to an end at about 3:30 p.m. Korea time. It all began a little past noon on this Monday after North Korea began live fire drills in 7 West Sea border regions north of the northern limit line. South Korea's defense ministry said North Korea fired around 500 artillery shells in waters north of the NLL and that some 100 of those shells fell south of the maritime border in South Korean waters near Baengnyeongdo Island. In response, the South Korean military shot around 300 artillery shells back across the NLL using K-9 self-propelled howitzers. Thousands of residents on South Korea's border islands were sent into shelters for cover. Now, North Korea had notified South Korea of its plans to conduct live fire drills this morning, not giving a specific time for the planned exercise, but demanding that Seoul keep its vessels out of the training zone.
And Sung-hee, we also hear that the South Korean military is still on high alert in case of follow-up provocations from the North.
That's right, Sean. Pyongyang says Monday's drills were part of its regular military exercises, but South Korea's defense ministry called it a pre-planned provocation. Now, this is the first time in recent history that the North has conducted a live fire drill in all 7 West Sea border regions. It's also the first time North Korea has informed the South of the exercise ahead of the time. The ministry said the South Korean military will work closely with the United States and keep close watch for possible clashes. The South Korean military has activated crisis management operations and has deployed naval convoys near the NLL to cope with any contingencies.
All right, Sung-hee, and South Korea's Presidential National Security Council convened an emergency meeting this evening. What was discussed?
The Standing Committee of South Korea's National Security Council was briefed on the situation by the Defense Ministry and discussed the North's motives behind its latest provocations. The committee, headed by the top presidential security advisor Kim Donghyuk, talked about the possibility of Pyongyang's further provocations and Seoul's plans for a strong and firm response when needed. The South Korean government will take the measures to protect the safety of South Koreans, not only near the western maritime border, but also near the demilitarized zone. Guys, it is worth mentioning that this is not the first time the North has fired artillery shells in this direction. In 2010, North Korea launched artillery strikes on a South Korean border island, killing 4 people, guys.
All right, thank you for keeping us up to date, Sung-hee. That was our Arirang News' Hwang Sung-hee with the latest on North Korea's live fire drills.
And speaking of growing threats out of North Korea, the regime warned on Sunday that it could carry out a new form of nuclear test.
Our Shin Se-min reports on the timing of the announcement and South Korea's response.
Despite Pyongyang's threat to carry out a 4th nuclear test, the South Korean government says there are no signs to indicate that one is in the works.
North Korea is capable of conducting nuclear or long-range missile tests at any time. But for now, there are no imminent signs of nuclear tests or missile launches.
Protesting a UN condemnation of its medium-range Nodong ballistic missile launches last week, North Korea raised tensions Sunday by threatening to conduct a new type of nuclear test. It was the regime's first mid-range missile launch in 4 years and followed a series of short-range rocket firings over the past 2 months.
We would not rule out a new form of nuclear test for bolstering our nuclear deterrence.
In response, Seoul's foreign ministry warned North Korea to keep in mind that it will pay the price if it neglects the grave demands from its neighbors and the international community and pushes ahead with another nuclear test. The United States also urged North Korea to refrain from disturbing regional peace and security, saying any nuclear test or ballistic missile launch are a grave violation of UN Security Council resolutions and that it will only further isolating Pyongyang. According to 38 North, a website run by the U.S.-Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University, recent satellite imagery shows mountains north and south of North Korea's Punggye-ri test site have been excavated to complexes that could allow for multiple tests. Joel Witt, a former State Department official and editor of the 38 North website, said North Korea is capable of carrying out a test within 4 to 6 weeks once it decides to do so. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
For an expert's take on the latest skirmish between the two Koreas, we bring in Dr. Kim Donghyuk, professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, in the studio. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Kim, how normal or scheduled were these recent exercises? And do you think that the shells that were, fired into the South Korean side of the Northern Limit Line were intentional or accidental?
I would say that it's in between. It's not a fully kind of intentional. It's like, planned for a year or two. But neither it was kind of accidental because it was not just an improvised one. But I would say that it is some sort of planned response to the United Nations resolution and then the U.S.-South Korean joint drill in the name of the Double Dragon. So I would say that, probably it was set up by North Korean regime after, their mid-range missile test and the UN resolution and then United States-South Korean joint drill.
See, and South Korea retaliated, responded with a K-9 artillery shelling and a dispatch fighter jets to the scene. Did we act appropriately?
I think so. First of all, South Korea showed a clear message to North Korea, says that definitely any kind of military provocation would be responded by South Korea, as some sort of like eye for an eye strategy. But at the same time, I would say that South Korea was very cautious in responding very carefully to North Korea's provocation. I would say some sort of finger for a finger. The South Korean military, very carefully selected a target after those, firing place by North Korea or in North Korea. And at the same time, this Air Force action was very cautious as well by just showing the signal that this Air Force is ready for responding, not just showing like some sort of aggressive action or offensive action to North Korea.
Well, this incident comes right after North Korea's threat of a new form of nuclear test. What does that exactly mean, and how is this already affected inter-Korean relations?
Well, in my opinion, I believe before we think about any kind of possible effects of a fourth nuclear test by North Korea, I would say that we have to think twice about the possibility of a fourth nuclear test by North Korea. I would say it's very least likely that North Korea would, actually go for a fourth nuclear test. First of all, China would not welcome it. Even I would say China feels very provoked or betrayed by North Korea's fourth nuclear weapon. If a fourth nuclear test would come up, and definitely there would be a test of a Ukrainian bomb, that means North Korea would become a kind of fully capable nuclear weapon state with the technology of both uranium and plutonium bomb. And China would not allow a sixth official nuclear weapon state on its right neighbor.
All right. You've excluded the possibility of fourth nuclear test, but how about further provocations like missile tests of some sort? And if so, how should the South Korean government react to that?
Even those missile tests will be very limited. That's what I would see. At this moment, I mean, I just said these kind of things in many kind of interviews or talks, that North Korea at this moment is very, very, concerned about the stability of its political regime at this moment, after the execution of Jang Sung-taek, or, very kind of, hostile scenarios to the safety of the regime. So, at this moment, North Korean regime is number one priority for policy is to stabilize the domestic politics. And then after that, probably they want to provoke South Korea or the United States with a further development of nuclear weapons. But at this moment, I don't think it's the right time for North Korea to go that far.
All right, Dr. Kim, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If everything goes according to plan, Korea will have a leaner fighting.
Your gateway to the day's biggest stories in Korea and around the world. Breaking news, the hottest interviews, and a whole lot more. Join Arirang's Sean Lim and Yoo Ji-hye from the heart of Seoul. Primetime news, weeknights, live at 10 on Arirang TV.
Next general elections.
There's a bumpy road ahead for the upcoming Korea-Japan ministerial meeting in April. There are even talks of the dialogue not taking place at all, as the two sides are struggling to work on an agenda over historical issues. Our Connie Kim reports.
Korea and Japan aren't seeing eye to eye on the agenda for ministerial-level talks scheduled for April, and new reports suggest they may not meet at all. A foreign ministry official from Seoul reaffirmed on Sunday that the discussions would focus solely on the women who were forced by the Japanese military to work as sex slaves during the Second World War. That runs counter to what a Japanese foreign ministry official told the press Friday. The official said the talks should not only center on the comfort woman issue, but also on other points of contention between the two countries. Chief Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Thursday that discussions should also include his government's claims over Korea-controlled Dokdo Island. If the two countries fail to sit down at the negotiating table in April, it's expected to have a further effect on bilateral relations. Tokyo proposed the ministerial-level talks to Seoul as a concession ahead of its trilateral summit with Korea and the United States last week. Korea's efforts to raise awareness of the comfort woman issue continues on an unofficial level. The House of Sharing, a shelter for former sex slaves, said it has invited Japan's First Lady Akie Abe for a visit. The proposal was made in mid-March during a meeting with Japanese diplomats. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
Some welcome news on the trade front. Korea posted a current account surplus for the 24th straight month in February as imports declined and the services account deficit narrowed. Hwang Sung-hee has the details.
Korea's central bank said Monday that the nation posted a current account surplus of over $4.5 billion last month. That's up over $1 billion from January and more than double from February of last year. Exports of goods rose over 7% from the previous year to $48 billion, while imports edged up slightly more than 1% to $42.6 billion. When asked if the surplus was coming from the nation's sluggish domestic demand, officials at the central bank said no, that the subdued import numbers were due to stable global commodities prices. The deficit in the service account, which includes tourism and shipping, also fell, helping the nation log a current account surplus for the 24th straight month. It posted a shortfall of around $1.5 billion last month, compared with a deficit of nearly $2 billion in January. The current account data was released based on a new international standard under which last year's current account surplus widened to $79.8 billion, up around $9 billion from the previous data. The central bank said last year's surplus accounted for 6% of the nation's gross domestic product. The nation's current account surplus has been acting as a buffer for Korea since the U.S. Federal Reserve began scaling back its massive bond-buying stimulus program. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
earlier today.
Two Samsung Group companies are merging. The deal announced Monday has Samsung SDI, the group's unit in charge of developing battery technologies, acquiring the group's textile firm, Seoul Industries. The merger will be finalized in July, and when that's done, Samsung SDI will be one of the conglomerate's biggest business units with market capitalization of 10 trillion won, or roughly $9.3 billion, and assets worth $14 billion. The Samsung SDI has been developing display and parts technologies with a new emphasis on batteries since the year 2002. Seoul Industry has been involved in the fashion, chemical, and electronic material industries since being founded in 1954.
Over the growing number of cases of measles in Southeast Asia, the Korea Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a health advisory on Monday. The largest outbreaks of the disease have been reported in the city of Manila and other areas in the Philippines. According to the KCDC, of the nearly 15,000 suspected cases of the disease reported this year, around 3,400 were confirmed to be infected. That surpassed all the cases reported in 2013. Korean health authorities are recommending that all travelers to the region should make sure they've received their two-stage measles vaccination before going abroad. Over now to a groundbreaking research by a group of Korean scientists who have developed a virtual hospital in a patch. The wearable adhesive uses the latest nanotechnology to monitor, store data, and deliver medication to patients. Our Park Ji-won shows us how it works.
It looks like a simple Band-Aid that can be easily adapted to a patient's skin, but it is much more complex than that. Thanks to nanotechnology, this flexible plaster can monitor patients' muscle activity and store information on their movements. After analyzing the data, it finally delivers the drugs via the skin.
This technology is important as it has established a systematic connection from monitoring and storing medical information like a patient's movements to delivering drugs after analyzing the data.
As this thin adhesive plaster can be stretched to allow for patients' movements, the patch could be a significant breakthrough in the treatment of movement disorder diseases like Parkinson's.
Temperature sensors or other biosensors can easily be added onto this on-the-skin device. It can also be used for multifunctional purposes in the prevention and treatment of diseases by effectively monitoring patients' conditions and delivering drugs in response to the data.
The team also say the patch could be very useful for telemedicine if attached with wireless communication technology. The study was published in the most recent edition of the scientific journal Nature Nanotechnology. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Let's check on some of the stories making headlines on the global front, from the U.S.-Russia talks in Ukraine to an election plan in Egypt. We go live to our Paul Lee at the News Center.
So, Paul, let's start with the Washington-Moscow dialogue that took place in Paris. Did the two sides manage to hammer out a deal to reduce tensions over Russia's annexation?
No deal. After 4 hours of talks, the top American and Russian diplomats agreed on only one thing, that the crisis in Ukraine requires a diplomatic solution, but they agreed on little else. Our Kim Donghyuk has more.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov discussed ways to resolve the Ukraine crisis during talks in Paris on Sunday. But the two men parted ways without any agreement in place.
In a frank conversation this evening with Foreign Minister Lavrov, I made clear that the United States still considers the Russian actions to be illegal and illegitimate, and Russia's actions over the past several weeks have placed it at odds, obviously, with the rule of law and the international community.
After 4 hours of talks, both sides recognized the importance of finding a diplomatic solution that meets the needs of the Ukrainian people. But they agreed on little else. Lavrov repeated that Russia has no plans to invade Ukraine and said he and Kerry had discussed setting up a neutral federal government in Ukraine.
All political forces in Ukraine will have an equal voice and can agree on which kind of concrete political, economic, financial, social, religious traditions will be respected in different parts of the country so that it becomes united and represents all the values of the Ukrainian people.
Ukrainian officials are hesitant to decentralize power. They fear that doing so would give more power to pro-Russia regions, something that could harm its aspirations to be a greater part of Europe and potentially tear the country apart. The Kerry-Lavrov meeting in Paris came days before NATO foreign ministers meet in Brussels on Tuesday and Wednesday, where talks are likely to center on Russia and its actions in Crimea and Ukraine. Kim Donghyuk, Arirang News.
And moving on to the latest developments on the missing Malaysian airliner. An international team of 10 aircraft and 11 ships entered the search zone Monday, spanning about 250,000 square kilometers. However, nothing of significance has been found. Authorities shifted operations northeast in the Indian Ocean based on new satellite images last week showing possible debris. But several floating objects found in recent days are not believed to be part of the missing plane. Despite the lack of progress, Australia's Prime Minister said Monday there will be no time limit placed on the search.
We owe it to everyone to do whatever we reasonably can, and we can keep searching for quite some time to come, and we will keep searching for quite some time to come.
In a press briefing late Monday, Malaysia's acting Transport Minister Hiz Hammuddin Hussein said his government would soon hold a special briefing for families of the victims from Flight 370. Officials say they still believe the Boeing 777 was deliberately diverted when it vanished on March 8th. By whom and why remains a mystery. And heading over to Egypt, where the government has announced the date for upcoming snap elections. The main election committee says the first round of voting will be held on May 26th and May 27th. They added if the first place candidate does not achieve a wide enough margin, voters will need to cast a second ballot in June. However, they did not clarify how wide a margin that would be. The head of the main organizing committee, Judge Anwar al-Assi, announced the details Sunday in a televised press conference. Former General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who ousted Egypt's first freely elected leader, Mohamed Morsi, is widely expected to win the election on the back of strong majority support. Al-Sisi stepped down as defense minister and the head of the country's armed forces last week in order to announce his candidacy. That wraps up our look at international stories making headlines around the world. I'll see you back here tomorrow night.
Hello and welcome to Primetime Sports. I'm Stephen Che. It was an eventful weekend for sports, but let's start with golf. For the ladies, the field is now set for the international crown in July, while for the men, Stephen Bowditch hangs on to win at Valero. Now, with the Kia Classic wrapped up, the world's top-ranked ladies from 8 nations, including South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, have locked their spots for the international crown. And based on the updated world rankings, the top 4 players from each country will team up to compete. The world number 1 of 51 weeks, Park In-bi, anchors the South Korean squad. Meanwhile, for the men, Stephen Bowditch finished at 8 under par to win the Valero Texas Open for his first PGA Tour victory. And moving on to tennis, Novak Djokovic dominated Rafael Nadal in a battle of the sport's best 2 athletes to lift the Sony Open trophy. Djokovic outclassed Nadal throughout the nearly hour-and-a-half affair, winning in straight sets for his 43rd title. And it follows Serena Williams' win over Lina in the women's final on Saturday. Meanwhile, Martina Hingis burst back into the scene, winning the women's doubles title alongside partner Sabine Lisicki. And heading to the U.S., the Major League Baseball season opened stateside with the NL West rivals, the Los Angeles Dodgers and San Diego Padres, going heads up. With the Padres' Andrew Cashner giving up a lone run on a Carl Crawford single, the Dodgers' Ryu Hyun-jin carried a 1-0 lead past the 7th. But in the 8th, the Padres broke through with a homer to tie and a rally to score 2 more, holding on to win with a final score of 3-1. And staying with baseball, let's get to Monday night action from the KBO. The Hanwha Eagles and the Lotte Giants squared off in Busan. Now Hanwha gets on board in the first as Kim Tae-gyun singles one home. It's 1-0. Then in the fourth, Chung Hyun-suk, he homers to left to make that 2-0 Hanwha. Then we get Lotte adding on a couple of runs in the sixth, and they hold on. And they add on in a couple more in the bottom of the eighth, and are currently leading 11-2 in the top of the ninth. And that's all I have for now. This has been Stephen Che. I'll see you back here later for more from the world of sports.
Well, we've been getting so much summer-like weather lately that the cherry blossoms have already bloomed.
Right, and that means Cherry Blossom Festival organizers have had to change their schedules around. But for more, let's turn things over to our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center. Bo-kyung.
Well, guys, flowers have begun to bloom about 2 weeks earlier than usual, and the last time flowers bloomed in March was all the way back in 1922. The 2014 Yeouido Cherry Blossom Festival will be held from April 3rd through the 13th. And the Tokchon Lake Festival from April 4th through April 6th. Now, taking a look at the current conditions, the nation is under the influence of a high-pressure system from the West Sea, which is why we're seeing light clouds in some places. Well, if you're headed out to see the flowers or for a late-night trip, make sure to grab a cardigan as it may be chillier in the evening. Otherwise, daytime highs will continue to remain in the low to mid-20s through Wednesday before showers fall on Thursday. Looking ahead at Tuesday's numbers, Seoul, Daegu, and Gwangju all make it to 23 degrees, while Busan hits 19. Moving on to other regions, Jeju tops out at 19 degrees, while Dokdo and Mount Kumgang peak in the mid-teens. Well, that's all the updates for this hour, and I'll be back with more after midnight.
Thanks, Bo-kyung. And that's our broadcast on this Monday night. I'm Yoo Ji-hae in Seoul.
And I'm Sean Lim. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.